My husband strolled into our family Christmas dinner with his secretary draped on his arm, introducing her as his girlfriend to everyone. 20 minutes later, he was staring at business sale documents, his face drained of all color. The look in his eyes when he realized I had sold Montgomery Construction, the company his grandfather built from nothing, was absolutely priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The living room in my parents' Victorian home had always been a sanctuary of warmth during the holidays. Family photos adorned the mahogany bookshelves, capturing decades of Christmas mornings, Thanksgiving feasts, and Easter egg hunts. The 12-foot Fraser fir in the corner sparkled with heirloom ornaments and twinkling lights, while a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the antique furniture that had witnessed generations of our family's celebrations. I stood by the bay window, absently adjusting the velvet curtains as I watched for arriving cars, my heart remarkably steady. The panic I'd experienced weeks ago when I discovered the affair had given way to a strange calm, the kind that settles after you've made an irrevocable decision and there's no going back. "Caroline, is everything all right?" My mother, Eleanor's voice came from behind me, gentle with concern. She'd sensed something was off the moment I arrived early to help arrange the Christmas place settings and hang the stockings on the mantel. My usual enthusiasm for holiday preparations had been replaced by quiet determination. "Everything's fine, Mom," I replied, turning to face her with a well-practiced smile. I'd perfected that smile over the past 8 years of marriage to James. Outwardly serene, while inside, I was calculating my next move. Eleanor studied my face, unconvinced. After 35 years as a family therapist, she could detect emotional armor from miles away. "You know you can tell me anything, sweetheart." For a moment, I considered telling her everything, about finding the explicit messages, the credit card statements showing hotel charges when James claimed to be at business, conferences, about discovering that my husband had been having an affair with his secretary, Vanessa, for nearly a year, about the manila envelope hidden in my designer handbag by the coat rack, containing documents that would end my husband's relationship with the business he loved more than anything, more than me, certainly. Instead, I simply nodded. "I know. Mom, let's make sure everything's ready. They'll be here soon." The "they" hung in the air between us. Eleanor didn't know that James and Vanessa would be arriving together, that my husband had decided tonight was the moment to bring his affair into the open, assuming I was still completely oblivious. He thought I'd be blindsided at this Christmas gathering. He had no idea I was 3 steps ahead of him. I moved to the dining room, meticulously adjusting the placement of each fork, knife, and spoon around my mother's best holiday china. 16 settings for 16 people: my parents, James's parents, my brother William and his wife and their 2 teenagers, James's sister Catherine and her husband, my aunt and uncle, my cousins Miranda and Marcus, and of course, James and me. One big happy family. Except 5 of these people had been keeping secrets. Vanessa, obviously. James, without question. But also Catherine, who had covered for her brother on countless occasions when he claimed to be working late or traveling for business. James's mother, Victoria, who I'd overheard on the phone with him 3 weeks ago saying, "You need to be more discreet, James. Caroline doesn't suspect anything, but she's not stupid." And Marcus, my own cousin, who had seen James and Vanessa together at a restaurant in the city but decided it wasn't his place to get involved. The betrayal ran deeper than just my marriage. It had tendrils that reached into both our families. The doorbell rang, sending a jolt through my body despite my preparation. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my crimson dress, James's favorite, and tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. The envelope in my purse seemed to pulse with energy, just a little longer. "I'll get it," I called out, moving toward the entryway with measured steps. Through the frosted glass panels of the front door, I could make out two silhouettes standing close together. Too close. My hand hesitated on the doorknob for just a second before I pulled it open, my smile firmly in place. "Hello," I said, my voice steady. James stood there, his arm casually wrapped around Vanessa's waist. His secretary, 8 years younger than me with the kind of striking beauty I'd always privately envied, had the decency to look uncomfortable, her eyes darting everywhere but my face. James, however, met my gaze with a strange mix of defiance and apology. "Caroline," he said, his voice carrying a rehearsed quality. "We need to talk." I stepped aside, allowing them into the house. "Yes," I agreed. "We certainly do. Everyone's almost here." James's eyebrows rose slightly, confused by my calm demeanor. He had expected tears, accusations, a scene at the door. My composure threw him off balance, the first crack in his carefully orchestrated plan. As they moved past me into the house, I caught the faint scent of Vanessa's perfume, the same one I had seen on our joint credit card statement 3 months ago, a $300 purchase James had explained away as a gift for my mother. The irony wasn't lost on me. My mother emerged from the kitchen, stopping abruptly at the sight of James and Vanessa together. Her eyes widened, darting between them, then to me, questions forming on her lips. "Mom," I said before she could speak, "James has something he wants to share with everyone over dinner. We should wait until everyone's here." Eleanor's gaze hardened as she looked at James, maternal instinct kicking in. In that moment, I knew she understood exactly what was happening, and I felt a surge of gratitude for the unconditional support I saw in her eyes. "Of course," she said coolly. "Dinner will be ready in 30 minutes. James, why don't you and your friend wait in the living room? The others should be arriving shortly." As they moved away, Eleanor pulled me aside, her voice a whisper. "Caroline, what's going on? Are you okay?" I squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I will be, Mom. I promise. I've got this under control." And I did. For the first time in years, I felt completely in control of my life. The weight of suspicion and uncertainty had been lifted the moment I discovered the truth. Now there was only the path forward, my path without James, without the constant doubt and diminishment that had become the backdrop of my marriage. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of arrivals, forced pleasantries, and curious glances. William arrived with his wife and teenage children, immediately sensing the tension in the air. James's parents followed, his father Richard clapping James on the shoulder, while Victoria embraced Vanessa with familiar affection that made my stomach turn. They knew her. Of course they did. The circle of deception widened with each new arrival. By the time we all gathered around the dining table, the air was thick with unspoken questions. I took my seat at one end, opposite my father, who always presided over family gatherings. James hesitated before sitting beside me, Vanessa taking the chair next to him instead of the place I had originally set for her across the table. A visible declaration. As my father began the traditional Christmas blessing of the meal, I reached for my purse beside my chair, my fingers closing around the manila envelope. The moment of truth was approaching, and with it, my liberation. I'd always been the responsible one, the planner, the woman with the 5-year goals and color-coded calendar. Caroline Ellis, later Montgomery, raised in the historic district of Oakwood where my parents had lived in the same 3-story Victorian for over 30 years, the house with the wraparound porch and the magnolia tree in the front yard where my father had built a swing that still hung there, faded but sturdy, like the family values they had instilled in me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot. To us! Now back to the story. At 36, I had built a life that looked perfect from the outside. A respected position as CFO at a regional bank, a stunning colonial revival home in the most exclusive neighborhood, a husband of 8 years who had taken over his family's construction business and expanded it into one of the state's most successful commercial builders. We were the couple friends pointed to and said, "They've got it all figured out." What they didn't see were the cracks forming beneath the polished surface. The way James's ambition had gradually twisted into something darker, more selfish. The way his compliments had evolved into subtle criticisms, always delivered with a smile. "You look nice tonight, Caroline. That dress almost makes you look as young as when we met." Or, "Good job on securing that loan for the business. Maybe next time try to negotiate a better interest rate, though. I know the bank is your specialty, but sometimes I wonder if you're really going to bat for us." Little by little, those comments had chipped away at my confidence, my sense of self. I'd started to see myself through his critical lens as somewhat inadequate, always falling slightly short of expectations. I'd begun dressing differently, speaking differently, even thinking differently, all in an effort to meet James's ever-shifting standards. The Christmas dinner proceeded with strained conversation and forced cheer. My father offered the bowl of roasted potatoes to me, pulling me back to the present moment. "Caroline, would you like to start?" I accepted the bowl, spooning a small portion onto my plate before passing it to James. Our fingers brushed during the exchange, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not hurt, not love. Just nothing. It was both liberating and terrifying to realize how completely my feelings for him had died. "So," my father continued, oblivious to the tension humming through the room, "how are things at Montgomery Construction? I heard you secured that downtown riverfront development." James cleared his throat, setting down his water glass. "It's going exceptionally well. In fact, we've just secured the additional funding we needed. Construction begins in February." "That's wonderful news," my mother said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Your family's company must be thriving under your leadership." "It is," James replied, his confidence returning as he discussed his work. "In fact, we're projecting our most profitable year ever. I've completely revitalized what my grandfather started." I watched him as he spoke, animated and engaging. This was the James I had fallen in love with 10 years ago, passionate about his work, charming, focused. We'd met at a charity auction where I was representing my bank as a sponsor. He was there because Montgomery Construction had donated labor for the community center being funded. He'd approached me as I was studying the silent auction items, considering a bid on a weekend getaway to the mountains. "The ski lodge package is overpriced," he'd said, standing close enough that I could smell his cologne. "But the lakeside cabin is the hidden gem. Private dock, sunset views, and the owner stocks the wine cellar with local vintages." I'd been intrigued by his insight, by the confidence in his blue eyes. We'd spent the rest of the evening discussing architecture, finance, and our shared love of historic buildings. By the end of the night, I'd given him my card, something I rarely did. By the end of the month, we were inseparable. The James sitting beside me now, casually discussing his business achievements while his hand occasionally brushed against his secretary's arm, was a stranger wearing my husband's face. "And what about you, Vanessa?" William asked, his tone deliberately casual, though his eyes were sharp. My brother had always been protective of me, and I suspected he'd picked up on the unusual dynamics at the table. "I heard you've been with Montgomery Construction for, 2 years now?" Vanessa flushed slightly, glancing at James before answering. "Yes, almost 2 years. I'm James's executive assistant." "Executive assistant," my mother echoed, her eyebrow raised. "That must keep you busy, especially with all the travel James does for the business." "It does," Vanessa replied quickly. "There's always something that needs handling." "I'm sure there is," I interjected, my voice calm despite the accelerated beating of my heart. "You've been particularly busy these past 11 months, haven't you?" A moment of silence fell over the table. James's parents exchanged glances. Catherine suddenly became very interested in cutting her turkey into perfectly equal pieces. "The company has been growing rapidly," James finally said, his voice steady but his fingers tightening around his fork. "Vanessa has been an invaluable asset to the business." "I'm sure she has," I replied, taking a sip of my wine. The conversation shifted to safer topics: the unseasonably warm December, William's daughter's college applications, my aunt's recent retirement. But the undercurrent remained electric and unavoidable. Everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I thought about the night I discovered the truth. It had been so ordinary, so mundane. James was working late, as he often did. I was organizing our home office, a task I'd been putting off for months. The drawer of his desk had stuck, and when I pulled it open with extra force, several items tumbled out, including his personal tablet. It hadn't been a deliberate invasion of privacy. The device had lit up when it fell, displaying a message preview from Vanessa. "Still thinking about last night. Can't wait until..." I'd stared at those words, my mind racing to find an innocent explanation. Perhaps they were discussing a business deal, a surprise for me, a charitable project. But deep down, I knew. The suspicion that had been growing in the back of my mind for months suddenly crystallized into certainty. I'd unlocked his tablet. He'd always used my birthday as his password, a fact that now seemed like a cruel joke, and found hundreds of messages spanning back 11 months. Photos, plans to meet, intimate conversations about their future together, discussions about how and when to tell me. I hadn't cried. I hadn't screamed or thrown things or called him in a rage. Instead, I'd methodically documented everything, taking screenshots, saving them to my secure cloud storage. Then I'd carefully replaced the tablet exactly as I'd found it and continued, organizing the office as if my world hadn't just imploded. The next morning, I'd called not a divorce lawyer, but a business broker. And when James mentioned the upcoming Christmas dinner, suggesting casually that we might have something important to share with everyone, I knew exactly what he was planning. So I made plans of my own. "James," his mother Victoria said, drawing my attention back to the dinner table. "Caroline is quiet tonight. Is everything all right?" I smiled at my mother-in-law, the woman who had welcomed me into her family, with open arms, who had shared the Montgomery family recipes and traditions, and who had apparently known for months that her son was betraying me. "I'm fine, Victoria," I replied, "just thinking about Revelations, how sometimes the truth has been right in front of us all along, but we choose not to see it." Victoria's smile faltered. She glanced at her husband, then at James, who had stopped eating and was staring at his plate. "Sometimes," I continued, my voice carrying clearly around the suddenly quiet table, "we think we know the people closest to us, only to discover we never really knew them at all." "Caroline," James said, a warning note in his voice. "What is it, James?" I asked, turning to face him fully. "Is there something you'd like to share with everyone?" "Something about you and Vanessa?" The table fell completely silent. All eyes moved between James, Vanessa, and me. This was the moment, the precipice I'd been moving toward since the night I discovered their betrayal. There was no turning back. Now. The tension around the dining table was palpable as all eyes fixed on James. He straightened in his chair, clearing his throat as he set down his fork with deliberate precision. This was a man accustomed to controlling the narrative, to having everyone hang on his words during board meetings and client presentations. But for once, I had seized the script from him, and his momentary fluster revealed how unprepared he was for this deviation from his carefully orchestrated plan. "I was going to wait until after dinner," James said, his voice regaining its usual confidence. "But since Caroline has brought it up..." He reached for Vanessa's hand, placing it atop the table for everyone to see. "Vanessa and I have developed feelings for each other over the past several months working together. We didn't plan for this to happen, but we've decided to be honest about our relationship." Vanessa's face flushed as she stared down at her barely touched dinner. At least she had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Honest?" The word escaped my lips as a half-laugh. "That's an interesting choice of words, James." My mother set down her glass with enough force that water sloshed over the rim. "James, are you telling us that you've been having an affair with Vanessa? With Caroline's knowledge?" James met my mother's gaze with practiced sincerity. "Eleanor, I know this is difficult to hear. Caroline and I have grown apart over the past couple of years. We've been living separate lives under the same roof. What Vanessa and I have found together is real connection, something that's been missing from my marriage for a long time." I marveled at how easily he rewrote our history, painting our marriage as a hollow shell when just last week we'd hosted his clients for a holiday party, his arm draped possessively around my shoulders as he'd introduced me as my brilliant wife, the financial wizard behind Montgomery Construction's success. The same week he'd taken Vanessa to the mountain cabin that had been a wedding gift from my parents. "How long?" My father's voice cut through the room, deep and controlled, but with an edge I rarely heard. "How long has this been going on, James?" James shifted slightly in his chair. "Dad, I understand you're upset." "I'm not your dad," my father interrupted coldly. "Answer the question." Vanessa spoke for the first time, her voice small. 11 months. 11 months, I repeated, nodding slowly. 11 months, during which James and I celebrated our 8th anniversary. During which we discussed having children. During which we attended Vanessa's office Christmas party together, and I gave her that beautiful scarf she's wearing right now. Catherine, James's sister, suddenly looked ill. She had known all along. I'd seen the messages between her and James where she had advised him on how to let Caroline down gently. Caroline. James's voice softened as he turned to me, adopting the sympathetic tone he used with difficult clients. I never meant to hurt you. These things. They just happen sometimes. People change. They grow apart. I think deep down, you felt it too. 5 years earlier, I might have believed him. 3 years earlier, I might have blamed myself, wondering what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed to keep his interest. 1 year earlier, I might have broken down in tears, begging him to reconsider, to give our marriage another chance. But the Caroline sitting at the table that evening was not the same woman who had walked down the aisle in a designer gown with stars in her eyes. That Caroline had gradually disappeared, eroded by 1,000 small moments of dismissal, of subtle undermining, of being made to feel that her thoughts and feelings were somehow less valid than his. The James the Y married had been charming, attentive, passionate about his work, but equally invested in our relationship. He brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. He listened attentively when I talked about my work at the bank. He made plans for our future that always included we and us and our. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. The change was so gradual I barely noticed it happening. The Sunday coffees became less frequent, then stopped altogether. My stories about work were interrupted with his more important projects. Our future plans became his career trajectory, with my role reduced to supportive spouse. "What exactly did you think would happen tonight, James?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You bring your secretary to my parents' house, announce you're leaving. Me for her, and then what? We all enjoy Christmas pudding together?" James's jaw tightened. This wasn't going according to his script. "I thought we could discuss this like adults, Caroline. I was planning to tell you privately before dinner, but you arrived early and were busy with preparations. How considerate of you," I replied. "And where were you planning to have this private conversation? In my parents' guest bathroom? Or perhaps in the garden where we took our engagement photos?" Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Maybe we should continue this another time," she suggested quietly. "This is a family dinner and what exactly do you think you are, Vanessa?" William interjected, his patience visibly fraying. "You've been sleeping with my sister's husband for nearly a year. Did that not factor into your decision at any point during these 11 months? Vanessa flinched as if she'd been slapped. Tears welled in her eyes, and for a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. James's mother finally broke her silence. "James, this isn't how we raised you," she said, disappointment evident in her voice. "You've handled this terribly." "Mom, please," James replied, exasperation creeping into his tone. "I'm trying to do the right thing by being honest now." "Now?" My father's laugh was harsh. "After 11 months? That's not honesty, son. That's damage control because you got caught." "I didn't get caught," James insisted, glancing at me with sudden suspicion. "Caroline and I have been having problems for a long time. This isn't about Vanessa. This is about our marriage not working anymore." It was always the same with James. Reframe the narrative. Shift the blame. Make it seem like circumstances beyond his control had forced his hand. In his mind, he was always the reasonable one, the victim of others' emotions or expectations. I'd watched him do it for years with clients, with colleagues, with friends. I just never thought I'd be on the receiving end of his manipulation so blatantly. "Our marriage not working anymore," I repeated thoughtfully. "Is that the phrase you settled on? Not I betrayed my wife with my secretary, or I've been lying to everyone for the better part of a year? Caroline, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be, James said, his patience visibly thinning. People fall out of love. Marriages end. It happens every day. You're right, I agreed, surprising him. It does happen every day. In fact, it's happening right now. This was it, the moment I'd been planning for since discovering those messages. I reached down beside my chair for my purse, feeling the weight of the manila envelope inside. 8 years of marriage reduced to legal documents and signatures. James's eyes followed my movement, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. This wasn't part of his plan. In his version of tonight's events, he would reveal his relationship with Vanessa. I would be stunned and emotional, and he would magnanimously offer to give me time to process. He would appear reasonable while I appeared hysterical. He would control the narrative while I struggled to catch up. But I was already 5 steps ahead of him, and for the first time in our marriage, James was about to discover what it felt like to be completely blindsided. The dining room fell silent as I pulled the manila envelope from my purse. It made a soft thud as I placed it on the table between the turkey and cranberry sauce. James's eyes fixed on it, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension. "What is that?" he asked, though I could tell from the sudden pallor of his face that he already suspected. "Why don't you open it and find out?" I suggested, my voice remarkably steady despite the thundering of my heart. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the gentle ticking of my mother's antique grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the seconds of this suspended moment. Then, slowly, James reached for the envelope, his fingers hesitating before finally grasping it. I watched as he opened the flap and slid out the documents, their crisp, official letterhead stark against the festive holiday tablecloth. His eyes scanned the first page, widening slightly as they reached the bold heading. "Sale of business agreement," he read flatly, looking up at me with genuine shock. "Montgomery Construction. You sold my company?" 3 days ago, I confirmed. The final papers were signed yesterday. Riverfront Capital has acquired all assets, contracts, and properties. They're keeping the name, though, part of the brand value. James's face flushed with anger as he flipped through the papers. "This is impossible. You can't sell the company. You don't have the authority." "Actually, I do," I replied calmly. "Or rather, we did, together. Remember when we restructured the business 2 years ago for tax purposes? You made me co-owner with equal controlling interest. You said it was just a formality since what's mine is yours." The color drained from James's face as realization dawned. "You need my signature?" he said, his voice hoarse. "Not anymore. If you'll turn to page 4, you'll see where I exercise the buy-sell provision in our operating agreement. As your business partner, I had the right to initiate a sale with board approval. The board voted unanimously." "The board?" James's voice rose incredulously. "My father is the board chairman." All eyes turned to Richard Montgomery, who had remained stone-faced throughout the exchange. The elderly man met his son's gaze with unexpected firmness. "I voted to approve the sale," he confirmed quietly, "after Caroline showed me proof of your indiscretions and explained how you've been manipulating company finances to fund your affair. I felt I had no choice." "Dad, that's ridiculous," James exploded. "What finances? What are you talking about?" I reached into my purse again and withdrew a second, thinner folder. The Aspen trip you billed as a client meeting. The downtown condo you've been paying for with company funds, listed as employee housing. The $12,000 diamond bracelet for Vanessa coded as client appreciation. It's all here, James. Every receipt, every misappropriation. Vanessa's hand flew to her wrist, where the diamond tennis bracelet gleamed under the dining room chandelier. She quickly tried to cover it, but it was too late. Everyone had seen. You've been embezzling from your family's company to finance your affair, I continued, my voice steady. When I discovered the extent of it, I had two choices: report you for fraud or find a buyer willing to salvage what's left of the Montgomery legacy. William let out a low whistle. Jesus, James. Your grandfather built that company from nothing. This is absurd, James sputtered, still flipping through the sale documents with increasing desperation. The sale price. This is half what the company is worth. It's exactly what the company is worth after accounting for the debt you've quietly accumulated and the projects you've mismanaged while you were distracted with other priorities. My father, who had remained remarkably composed, finally spoke. I think we should give James and Caroline some privacy to discuss this. That won't be necessary, Dad, I said, never taking my eyes off James. There's nothing to discuss that can't be said in front of everyone. After all, James and Vanessa were planning to announce their relationship tonight. I'm simply adding my own announcement to the agenda. James shuffled through the papers, his architectural precision reasserting itself as he methodically reviewed each page. You've already transferred the accounts, the staffing contracts. You've even... He paused, swallowing hard. You've even specified that I keep my company vehicle as part of my severance package. The business broker thought it was best to be thorough, I explained. It should make for a cleaner break, assuming you find the terms agreeable. Of course, Riverfront Capital has indicated they might be interested in offering you a position, junior project manager, I believe. Junior project manager? James's voice cracked with indignation. At my own company? Former company, I corrected gently. James's mother interjected, her voice strained. Caroline, don't you think you're being hasty? Perhaps with some discussion? Victoria, I cut her off. When did you find out about James and Vanessa? The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Victoria's face flushed as she exchanged a quick glance with her husband. She hesitated. I'm not sure what you mean. Please don't insult my intelligence on top of everything else, I said quietly. I know James confided in you. I'd just like to know when. After a moment's hesitation, Victoria sighed. About 5 months ago. But Caroline, he was confused, and we advised him to end things with Vanessa and recommit to your marriage. Obviously, that advice didn't take, William muttered. James ignored his comment, still staring at the sale documents. How did you find out? He finally asked. About Vanessa and me? How long have you known? Does it matter? I countered. Yes, he insisted, looking up at me. It matters to me. I considered deflecting again, but something in his expression, perhaps genuine curiosity rather than his usual strategic probing, made me decide to tell him the truth. 6 weeks ago, I said, I found your messages while organizing the office. All of them, including the ones where you discuss the downtown condo you've been furnishing together, the ones where you planned weekend getaways while telling me you were at business conferences, the ones where you complained about how stifling your marriage had become. Vanessa blanched. no doubt remembering the specific content of some of those exchanges. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Catherine seemed to find her water glass utterly fascinating. "I see," James said after a moment, setting the papers down carefully. "And you've been planning this ambush ever since?" There it was, the first attempt to reframe, to make me the villain in his narrative. Classic James. "Ambush?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's an interesting characterization from the man who brought his girlfriend to a family Christmas dinner to announce he was leaving his wife." "I was trying to be respectful," James insisted, his voice rising slightly. "I wanted to tell you privately first, but then planned to be honest with everyone rather than hiding or sneaking around anymore." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "Respectful? You've been sneaking around for 11 months, James, with my employee. In what universe is any of that respectful?" James's jaw tightened, a familiar sign that his patience was wearing thin. He'd always hated being challenged, especially publicly. "You know what I mean, Caroline. I was trying to handle this with dignity." "Dignity?" my father asked sharply. "Certainly not my daughter's." "Sir, with all due respect, this is between Caroline and me," James replied, his professional demeanor slipping back into place. "We've grown apart. These things happen. I never intended to hurt anyone." I studied him, this man I had loved, trying to see if he genuinely believed his own words or if he knew he was spinning fiction. It was hard to tell. James had always been skilled at convincing himself of whatever narrative best served his interests. "You know what the saddest part is?" I said finally. "I don't even think you're lying right now. I think you've convinced yourself that this was somehow inevitable, that you had no agency in it, that it just happened. As if having an affair with your secretary for 11 months was something that occurred to you rather than something you actively chose, day after day." "Caroline," Vanessa began, but I cut her off with a raised hand. "No, Vanessa, you don't get to speak right now. Not after sitting across from me at business dinners, asking about my marriage, even helping me plan James's surprise birthday party, all while sleeping with my husband. You've said quite enough over the past 11 months. Vanessa's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks, but I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no remorse, just a vast emptiness where my feelings for these people had once resided. James reached for the sale documents again, flipping to the eye. Last page where the signatures were already affixed. For a moment, I thought he might tear them up right there, a futile gesture of defiance amidst the half-eaten holiday dinner and stunned family members. Instead, he carefully slid the papers back into the envelope and set it down between us. When he looked up, his expression had changed. The shock had faded, replaced by something cooler, more calculated. This was James the negotiator, James the strategist, the version of my husband I'd learned to be wary of over the years. "I'll need to review these with my lawyer," he said calmly. "The terms seem problematic at first glance, but there may be room for discussion. In the meantime..." He turned to Vanessa, who was still fighting back tears. "Perhaps we should go." "That's it?" William asked incredulously. "Your wife tells you she sold your family's company after discovering your affair, and your response is, 'I'll have my lawyer look these over'?" James stood, straightening his suit jacket with practiced precision. "What would you have me do, William? Create a scene? Caroline has clearly made her decision, and she's entitled to that. I'm simply respecting her choice." And there it was again. The reframing, the subtle shift in narrative. Suddenly, he was the reasonable one, graciously accepting my decision, rather than facing the consequences of his actions. It was masterful, really. If I hadn't spent years watching him work, I might have missed it entirely. "James," I said as he pulled out Vanessa's chair, "you forgot something." He paused, looking back at me with a raised eyebrow. "What's that?" I gestured to the envelope. "Your copy of the sale documents. You'll need them for your lawyer." After James and Vanessa left, the dining room remained suspended in uncomfortable silence. My mother busied herself clearing plates that were still half full, a nervous energy propelling her movements. My father sat motionless, his hands folded. On the table, eyes fixed on the space where the business documents had been. William had stepped outside to call his wife, who had taken the teenagers home early, no doubt filling her in on the evening's dramatic turn. "Caroline," my aunt finally ventured, her voice gentle. "Are you all right, dear?" Was I all right? It seemed like such a simple question, yet I found myself unable to formulate a coherent answer. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a strange hollow that wasn't quite pain, wasn't quite relief, just emptiness where something vital used to be. "I think I need a moment," I said, rising from my chair with as much dignity as I could muster. "Excuse me." I made my way upstairs to my old bedroom, preserved like a time capsule from my high school and college years. Academic trophies still lined the bookshelf. Faded photographs of long-ago friends were still tucked into the frame of the mirror. The queen bed was still covered with the blue quilt my grandmother had made for my 18th birthday. Closing the door behind me, I sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing my carefully constructed facade to crumble. My hands, steady, throughout dinner, now trembled as I pressed them against my face. The tears I'd been holding back didn't come, though. Instead, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were observing someone else's life falling apart rather than my own. I glanced around the room at the artifacts of a younger Caroline who had dreamed of love that looked nothing like what my marriage had become. That Caroline had believed in partnership, in mutual respect, in growing together rather than apart. She had trusted that love, when real, didn't fade or transform into whatever twisted thing James had offered in its place. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from James. "We need to talk. Just the two of us. This isn't how this should end." I stared at the message, noting how perfectly it encapsulated James's approach to our entire relationship. We need to talk. Not, "I'm sorry," or "I was wrong," or any acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. Just the assumption that if he could get me alone, he could control the narrative once more. This isn't how this should end. As if there were a proper protocol for concluding a marriage destroyed by betrayal, as if my deviation from his script was the true offense, rather than his 11-month affair with my employee. I didn't respond, instead setting the phone face down on the nightstand. James had monopolized enough of my emotional energy. I wouldn't give him a single moment more tonight. A soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. "Caroline, it's Mom. May I come in?" "Yes," I called, straightening my posture and tucking a stray strand of hair behind my ear. Reflexive gestures of composure that seemed pointless now. Eleanor entered carrying 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. She set them on the nightstand and sat beside me on the bed, close enough for comfort, but not so close as to crowd me. My mother had always understood the delicate balance of support and space. "With peppermint schnapps," she said, nodding toward the mugs. "Just like when you came home after your first heartbreak in college." A smile tugged at my lips despite everything. Some things never change. And some things do, she replied, her voice gentle but firm. Sometimes they have to. We sat in silence for a moment, the familiar scent of chocolate and peppermint filling the room. Outside, I could hear muffled voices as the remaining dinner guests presumably discussed the evening's revelations. I wondered what consensus they were reaching, whose side they were taking, whether any of it really mattered anymore. "How long have you known?" Eleanor finally asked, her eyes searching my face. "That something wasn't right between you and James?" I considered the question, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when doubt had first crept in. Had it been when James started working late? Without explanation? When he began criticizing my clothes, my friends, my interests? When intimacy became rare, then perfunctory, then non-existent? I think part of me has known for at least a year, I admitted. But I kept making excuses, blaming his stress at work or my own insecurities. It was easier than facing the truth. Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. "And Vanessa? When did you suspect her involvement?" "I didn't," I said simply. "Not until I found the messages. That part was unexpected." My mother's face tightened, anger flickering across her features. "Of all people, his secretary, in your own bank, at your own events, all this time." "Mom," I interrupted gently, "it doesn't matter who it was. If it hadn't been Vanessa, it would have been someone else. The problem wasn't her, it was James, it was our marriage." It was a realization that had crystallized for me during those sleepless nights after discovering the affair. Vanessa's betrayal hurt, of course. The professional complications made everything messier, more painful. But ultimately, she was a symptom, not the disease itself. The real illness had been growing in my marriage long before she entered the picture. "You're right," Eleanor conceded after a moment, "but that doesn't make what she did any less despicable." I reached for my mug, letting the warmth seep into my palms. "No, it doesn't, but focusing on her betrayal feels beside the point now. I'm more concerned with how I didn't see what was happening in my own marriage, how I let things deteriorate so badly without confronting them. You can't blame yourself for his choices, Caroline." "I'm not," I assured her. "James's actions are his responsibility alone, but I am responsible for how long I allowed myself to be diminished, for how much of myself I surrendered trying to be what he wanted." Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "When did that start? The diminishment?" The question struck me with unexpected force. When had it started? Not all at once, certainly. There had been no single moment I could point to and say, "There, that's when I began to disappear." It had been gradual, insidious. "I think it started with small things," I said slowly. "Memories, surfacing. Comments about my clothing being too conservative for a banking executive. Suggestions that my career was less important than his. Jokes at my expense when we were with friends that I laughed off because I didn't want to seem oversensitive." I took a sip of hot chocolate, organizing my thoughts. Then it progressed to bigger things. He started making decisions without consulting me, financial choices, vacation plans, even which friends we'd maintain relationships with. If I objected, he'd make me feel irrational or difficult. "Why didn't you say something?" my mother asked, her voice pained. "To me? To your father? To anyone?" I smiled sadly. Because I was embarrassed. Because admitting there were problems meant acknowledging that the life I'd been presenting to everyone, this perfect marriage, this perfect partnership was a facade. And because part of me believed I really was the problem, that if I could just be better, more supportive, more understanding, things would improve. Oh, Caroline. Eleanor sighed, reaching for my hand. You've always been so independent, so strong-willed. I never imagined you could be made to feel that way. Neither did I admitted. But it happens so slowly you hardly notice. By the time you realize what's happening, you're already lost. We fell silent again, the weight of my words settling between us. Downstairs, I could hear the front door opening and closing as guests presumably departed, the evening thoroughly ruined by James's revelation and my countermove with the business sale. What happens now? My mother finally asked. It was the question I'd been asking myself for 6 weeks, ever since finding those messages. What happens after you dismantle the life you've spent 8 years building? Where do you go when the future you'd planned suddenly evaporates? Now I rebuild, I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. I figure out who Caroline is without James, what she wants, what she dreams about, what makes her happy. And the divorce? My lawyer thinks it will be straightforward. The prenup limits how much James can fight. 3 months, maybe 6, and it will be final. Eleanor squeezed my hand. You seem remarkably calm about all this. I've had 6 weeks to process, I reminded her. 6 weeks of anger, grief, shock, planning. Tonight was just the execution of those plans. You didn't answer my calls, he said, a note of accusation in his voice. No, I agreed simply. I didn't. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his gaze moving from my face to the half-packed suitcase on the bed. You're leaving. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. Yes, I need some time away. With him? James asked, a bitter edge to his words. For a moment, I was genuinely confused. With who? Whoever you've been seeing. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You found someone else, and now you're using Vanessa as an excuse to end our marriage and sell my company. The accusation was so absurd, so perfectly in line with James's tendency to deflect and project, that a startled laugh escaped me. Are you serious right now? It makes sense, he continued, warming to his theory. The sudden sale, the calm way you handled everything last night. You've already moved on. James, I said firmly, I am not seeing anyone. I didn't cheat on you. You cheated on me with my employee for 11 months. He flinched slightly at the blunt recitation of facts. It's more complicated than that. No, it's really not, I countered, zipping my suitcase closed with finality. It's actually quite simple. You betrayed our marriage. You lied to me repeatedly for the better part of a year. And now you're trying to make this somehow about me. That's not what I'm doing, he protested, moving further into the room. I'm just trying to understand why you're being so cold, so calculated about all this. What did you expect, James? Tears? Begging? A complete emotional breakdown? I expected my wife to at least talk to me before selling my family's company and serving me with what amounts to a termination notice in front of my entire family. And I expected my husband not to sleep with my employee, I shot back. I guess we're both dealing with disappointment. James's expression hardened, the vulnerability of a moment ago vanishing behind the familiar mask of controlled displeasure I'd grown to recognize over the years. He moved toward me, stopping just short of invading my personal space. Close enough to be intimidating, but not so close that I could accuse him of threatening me. It was a calculated distance, like everything else about him. "You're being unreasonable," he said, his voice dropping to that quiet, intense register he used when he wanted to appear both rational and wounded. "I made a mistake. A serious one, yes. But does that really justify ending 8 years of marriage without even attempting to work through it?" I held my ground, refusing to step back despite the urge to create more distance between us. 11. Months isn't a mistake, James. It's a choice you made day after day. And yes, some choices are irreversible. People overcome affairs all the time, he persisted. Couples go to counseling. They rebuild trust. They come out stronger. Those couples don't involve a husband sleeping with his wife's employee, I pointed out. And more importantly, those couples actually want to save their marriage. A flicker of genuine hurt crossed his face. And you don't? The simple question hung in the air between us, demanding an answer I hadn't fully articulated even to myself until this moment. Did I want to save my marriage? Was there anything left worth salvaging from the wreckage of James's betrayal? No, I said finally, the truth of it settling into my bones. I don't. James took a step back as if physically struck by my words. You can't mean that. We've built a life together, Caroline. One indiscretion. 11 months is not an indiscretion, I interrupted. And it's not just about Vanessa. It's about who you've become. Who I've become when I'm with you. What does that even mean? He asked, frustration creeping into his voice. I searched for words to explain the slow erosion of self I'd experienced, the gradual diminishment that had happened so subtly I barely noticed until it was nearly complete. Do you remember when we first met? I asked. At that charity auction? James's expression softened slightly at the memory. Of course. You were wearing that navy blue dress with the pearl earrings? Your hair was shorter then. And I was talking about the community center designs, I continued. I was saying how the architect had incorporated natural light to create both warmth and energy in a space meant for healing. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. You were so passionate about it. I thought you might be in architecture yourself. That's who I was, James. Someone with opinions and passion and a voice. I gestured between us. But somewhere along the way, in this marriage, I stopped being that person. I became smaller, quieter, more careful not to contradict or challenge. You. That's ridiculous, he scoffed. You've always been free to express yourself. Have I? When was the last time you actually asked what I thought about something important? When was the last time you listened, really listened, without dismissing or correcting me? James opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, unable to produce a concrete example. The truth is, I continued, I've spent years trying to be the version of me that you wanted. The supportive wife who never questions your decisions. The perfect hostess for your business clients. The woman who overlooks your late nights at the office and doesn't make demands on your time or attention. You're making me sound like some kind of monster, James protested. I've always supported your career, your interests. As long as they didn't interfere with yours, I finished for him. As long as they didn't require you to make any significant adjustments to your life. Before James could respond, the sound of the front door opening echoed from downstairs, followed by my father's voice calling up, Caroline, your 10 minutes are up. James's expression darkened. You brought your parents to our house? They drove me here, I explained, reaching for my suitcase. I'm staying with them for now. This is absurd, he muttered, running a hand through his hair in frustration. You're acting like a child running home to mommy and daddy instead of facing our problems like an adult. The condescension in his tone was so familiar, so predictable that it almost made me laugh. Even now, confronted with the consequences of his own actions, he couldn't resist trying to make me feel immature and irrational. No, James, I said calmly. I'm acting like a woman who knows her own worth, who refuses to stay in a marriage with someone who doesn't respect her enough to remain faithful, who's finally setting boundaries after years of having them ignored or dismissed. Footsteps on the stairs announced my parents' approach. James glanced toward the hallway, his jaw tightening as he realized our private conversation was about to be interrupted. Where are you going? He asked, his voice lower now, urgent. Your mother said you were taking some time away. Where? That's not your concern anymore, I replied, lifting my suitcase from the bed. The hell it isn't, he snapped, the polished veneer finally cracking to reveal the anger beneath. You're still my wife. I have a right to know where you'll be. You forfeited that right when you started sleeping with my employee, I said simply. My father appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral but his stance protective. Everything okay in here? Fine, Dad, I assured him. I'm ready to go. James looked between us, realization dawning that he was losing control of the situation, and of me. It was a novel experience for him, I imagined, this sensation of powerlessness. Caroline, please, he said, his tone softening again, pivoting seamlessly from anger to appeal. Just give me a chance to explain everything properly, without an audience. We owe our marriage at least that much. For a brief moment, I felt the familiar pull of his persuasion, the well-practiced sincerity in his eyes, the perfectly calibrated note of humility in his voice. How many times had I yielded to that combination in the past, setting aside my own needs or concerns because he made such a convincing case for his? No, James, I said quietly but firmly. The time for explanations was before you decided to betray our marriage. Before you brought your girlfriend to a family Christmas dinner to announce you were leaving me. Before you made me feel like I was somehow deficient for years. I moved past him toward the door, suitcase in hand. My lawyer will be in touch about the next steps in the divorce proceedings. Until then, I'd appreciate it if you didn't contact me. You can't just walk away, he called after me, a note of desperation finally breaking through his controlled facade. We need to talk about this. I paused at the top of the stairs, turning to face him one last time. That's the thing, James. For the first time in years, I don't need to do anything you say. And it feels absolutely liberating. The 4-hour drive to the lake house passed mostly in silence. My father focused on the winding roads as we climbed higher into the mountains, while I stared out the window at the passing landscape. The urban sprawl gradually gave way to suburbs, then to farmland, and finally to the dense pine forests that signaled our approach to Lake Harmony. My mind, however, was still back at the house, replaying my confrontation with James. His shifting tactics, from accusation to appeal, from self-righteousness to vulnerability, were so predictable that I could almost chart them on a graph. What surprised me was my own response, the clarity and strength I'd found to resist his manipulations. Where had that version of me been hiding all these years? You're quiet, my father observed as we turned onto the gravel road that led to the lake house. Second thoughts? No, I said firmly. Just processing. It's strange to realize how easily I fell into certain patterns with James, how I learned to accommodate his moods, his needs, his expectations, often at the expense of my own. My father nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes we don't notice the water rising until we're nearly drowning. That's exactly it, I agreed. It was so gradual. A small compromise here, a minor concession there. By the time I realized how much of myself I'd surrendered, it seemed easier to keep surrendering than to fight for that lost ground. And now? He asked, glancing at me briefly before returning his attention to the increasingly rugged road. Now, I take it back, I said simply. All of it, starting with this week. The lake house appeared around the next bend, its weathered cedar exterior blending harmoniously with the surrounding forest. It wasn't large or luxurious, just a sturdy 3-bedroom structure with a spacious living area, a well-appointed kitchen, and a wide deck that wrapped around 3 sides with a stunning view of Lake Harmony. But it represented something I desperately needed. Space to think, to plan, to rediscover the woman I'd been before James began reshaping me into his ideal wife. My great-aunt Lillian had lived here year-round until her arthritis made the isolation impractical. Now she lived in a retirement community in Florida, and the lake house served as a family retreat. I hadn't visited in over 2 years. James had always preferred more sophisticated vacation destinations. But as we pulled up to the familiar building, I felt a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with the structure itself and everything to do with the freedom it represented. Your mother called the caretaker, my father said as he cut the engine. She had him stock the fridge and make sure everything's working. You should be all set for at least a week. Thanks, Dad, I said, squeezing his hand. For everything. We unloaded my suitcase and a box of additional supplies my mother had, insisted on packing just in case, and carried them into the lake house. The interior was just as I remembered. Stone fireplace, comfortable but worn furniture, shelves lined with well-thumbed paperbacks left by various family members over the years. A faint scent of pine and wood smoke lingered in the air, comforting and familiar. I should head back before it gets dark, my father said, setting the box on the kitchen counter. Your mother will want a full report. I smiled, imagining my mother pacing the house, waiting for confirmation that I was safely installed in my mountain sanctuary. Tell her I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. I think this is exactly what I need right now. My father pulled me into a tight hug. Call us if you need anything at all. I will, I promised. After he left, the silence of the lake house enveloped me completely. No traffic noise, no neighbors, no sound but the gentle rustling of pine needles in the breeze and the occasional call of a bird. I moved to the deck, settling into one of the Adirondack chairs that faced west toward the lake below. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the landscape and painting the distant ridges in shades of purple and gold. For the first time since discovering James's betrayal, I allowed myself to be still, not planning, not reacting, not strategizing, just existing in the moment, breathing in the pine-scented air and feeling the tension in my shoulders gradually release. As darkness fell, I returned inside and unpacked my suitcase, arranging my clothes in the bedroom dresser with methodical precision. The simple act of placing my belongings in these drawers, of claiming this space as my own, felt like a small but significant step toward reclaiming my independence. In the kitchen, I found that the caretaker had indeed stocked the refrigerator well. Fresh produce, dairy, eggs, and other essentials filled the shelves. I made myself a simple dinner of pasta with olive oil and garlic, realizing as I ate that it was the first real meal I'd had since the disastrous Christmas dinner the night before. After washing my dishes, I settled on the living room sofa with a legal pad I'd brought along. It was time to be strategic. James wouldn't simply accept defeat and walk away. That much was clear from our interaction at the house. He would continue pushing, manipulating, attempting to regain control of the situation. I needed to be prepared. At the top of the page, I wrote, "Divorce Strategy," in bold letters. Beneath it, I began listing everything I needed to address. Legal, representation, already retained, Emma Kingsley, need to update her on recent developments, schedule meeting for when I return to town. Financial matters, joint accounts need to be separated, investment portfolio division per prenup, mortgage on house, retirement accounts. Living arrangements, stay with parents temporarily, find apartment or condo in town eventually. Sell house or buy out James's share. Personal items to retrieve from house, important documents, irreplaceable personal items, family heirlooms. Communication boundaries. No direct contact with James if possible. All communication through lawyers. Block on social media. What to? Tell mutual friends, colleagues. Prepare concise explanation. Focus on moving forward rather than details of betrayal. Work considerations. Notify HR of name change back to Ellis. Address potential gossip. Consider timing with upcoming bank leadership offsite. The list grew longer as I continued to think through the practical aspects of dismantling an 8-year marriage. It was overwhelming, but also strangely empowering to see it laid out so clearly. These were concrete steps, actionable items that would move me from James's wife back to simply Caroline. When I reached the bottom of the page, I hesitated, then added one final category: self-rediscovery. What do I want now? What did I set aside for James's sake? Who am I beyond this marriage? This last section was both the most important and the most daunting. The practical matters of divorce, while complex and potentially contentious, were ultimately just logistics. But rebuilding my sense of self after years of subtle erosion, that was the real challenge ahead. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. I need to update you on a personal situation that might have professional implications. His expression turned serious as he gestured for me to sit. I'm listening. In clear, concise terms, I explained the situation, James's affair, our impending divorce, and most significantly, my sale of Montgomery Construction. I wanted you to hear it directly from me, I concluded. I know James has relationships with several of our commercial clients, and there might be questions or concerns. Edward leaned back in his chair, studying me with the assessing gaze that had intimidated me when I first joined the bank, but that I now recognized as careful consideration rather than judgment. First, I'm sorry about your marriage. That's a personal blow no one should have to endure. His voice was kind but professional. As for the business implications, I appreciate your transparency. The sale of Montgomery Construction was your legal right as co-owner? Yes, everything was above board and properly documented. He nodded. Then, professionally speaking, you've done nothing wrong. If anything, you've demonstrated the kind of decisive action in a crisis that we value in leadership. I felt a weight lift that I hadn't realized I was carrying. I'd been so focused on the personal ramifications of my actions that I'd half convinced myself the professional fallout might be severe. Actually, Edward continued, this might be the right moment to discuss something I've been considering. The board and I have been talking about establishing a women's financial empowerment initiative, specialized services, educational programs, targeted investment opportunities. It's been on the back burner, but with First National launching something similar, we need to move quickly. My heart rate quickened. This was eerily similar to the business plan I'd shelved years ago at James's urging. I'd like you to head it up, Edward said. Full creative control, dedicated staff, your own budget. It would mean a significant expansion of your current role, of course. I stared at him, momentarily speechless. Edward, that's exactly the kind of initiative I've wanted to develop for years. He smiled. I know. I remember that proposal you shared informally back when you first joined the executive team. James mentioned you'd decided it wasn't the right time, but I always thought it showed remarkable insight. Of course, James had presented it as my decision rather than his influence. The timing is perfect now, I said, resolution filling my voice. I'd like to start mapping out the framework immediately. As I left Edward's office, a new energy propelled me forward. The universe, it seemed, had been waiting for me to reclaim my power, to step back into the fullness of who I was. Meant to be, opportunities that had seemed closed were suddenly opening wide before me. My next stop needed to be my parents' house to assure them I'd returned safely, but as I drove, I realized there was another place I needed to visit first, a place that represented both what I was leaving behind and what I was moving toward. I parked my car along the riverfront downtown, where the skeletal framework of what would have been Montgomery Construction's crowning achievement stood silhouetted against the winter sky. The Riverside development, a mixed-use project comprising luxury condominiums, upscale retail space, and a cultural center, had been James's obsession for the past 3 years. Now, under new ownership, it would become someone else's vision. I stepped out into the crisp January air, wrapping my scarf tighter as I approached the chain-link fence surrounding the construction site. A large sign featuring the Montgomery Construction logo still hung there, though it would soon be replaced with Riverfront Capital's branding. I touched the metal fence, feeling its cold solidity beneath my fingers. This project had consumed so much of our lives, countless dinner conversations, weekend site visits, late nights reviewing architectural plans. James had poured his ambition into these steel beams and concrete foundations, often at the expense of our relationship. Yet, staring at it now, I felt no regret for what I'd done, only a profound sense of release. The company, like my marriage, was part of a past I was leaving behind. I thought I might find you here. The voice behind me sent a jolt through my body. I turned to find Vanessa standing a few feet away, huddled in an elegant camel coat, her expression impossible to read. Vanessa. I acknowledged her presence with a nod, neither welcoming nor dismissive. What are you doing here? Same as you, I imagine. She moved to stand beside me, both of us now facing the construction site. Saying goodbye. We stood in silence for a moment, an unlikely pair of mourners for different kinds of losses. I've been let go, she finally said. The new owners are bringing in their own executive team. I'm sorry, I replied, surprised to find I meant it. Despite everything, losing one's livelihood was never easy. Vanessa gave a small, humorless laugh. No, you're not. And you shouldn't be. It's the least I deserve. Another silence settled between us, less tense than before. I didn't know, she said quietly. About the financial improprieties, I mean. I knew James was using company resources for personal expenses, but I had no idea how extensive it was. I studied her profile, searching for deception, and finding only weary resignation. Would it have mattered if you had known? She turned to face me fully. I'd like to think so, but honestly, I don't know. I was infatuated. He has a way of making you feel like you're the only person who truly understands him, who sees his brilliance. Yes, I agreed softly. He does. For what it's worth, Vanessa continued, her voice barely audible above the winter wind. I'm truly sorry, Caroline. Not just for the affair, but for betraying your trust as an employee, as a woman. There's no excuse for what I did. The apology hung in the air between us, sincere yet inadequate for the magnitude of the betrayal. What was the appropriate response to the woman who had helped dismantle my marriage? Forgiveness seemed premature, continued anger exhausting. What will you do now? I asked instead, steering us toward safer ground. I've accepted a position in Chicago, executive assistant at an architectural firm. She gave a wry smile. Different city, different firm, much stricter boundaries. That's good, I said, meaning it. A fresh start. Vanessa nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. James is completely unraveled, you know. The company was everything to him, his identity, his legacy. Taking that away, it broke something in him. I felt a flicker of emotion. Not guilt exactly, but acknowledgement of the magnitude of what I'd done. The company was his grandfather's legacy, not his, and he risked it for an affair. I'm not defending him, Vanessa clarified quickly. Just letting you know, he's been drinking heavily, making wild accusations, says he'll contest the sale, though his lawyer has apparently told him it's futile. Is that meant to make me feel sorry for him? No, she shook her head. It's meant to warn you. Be careful, Caroline. He's not thinking clearly. The warning sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the January temperature. I'd seen James angry before, but always contained, calculated. The thought of him unhinged was unsettling. Thank you for telling me, I said, my voice steady despite the unease settling in my stomach. Vanessa glanced at her watch. I should go. My flight to Chicago leaves in 3 hours. She hesitated, then extended her hand. Goodbye, Caroline. I looked at her outstretched hand for a moment before accepting it briefly. Goodbye, Vanessa. As she walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement, I turned back to the construction site. The encounter had been surreal yet oddly clarifying. While Vanessa had been a participant in my betrayal, she wasn't its architect. That distinction belonged solely to James. I took one last look at the skeletal building that had once represented so much: ambition, success, future, and found it held no power over me anymore. Then I returned to my car and drove to my parents' home, where I knew they would be waiting with worry and warm food. 4 weeks after my return from the lake house, I sat in my lawyer Emma Kingsley's office, reviewing the latest communication from James's legal team. Emma, a sharp-minded woman in her 50s with a reputation for fair but formidable divorce settlements, frowned as she tapped a manicured nail against the document. He's contesting the prenuptial agreement, she said, her tone suggesting this was both expected and irritating. claims it was signed under duress and doesn't reflect a fair division of assets acquired during the marriage. I leaned back in my chair, unsurprised yet still disappointed. The prenup had been James's idea. In the first place, his family had insisted on it to protect their assets, which included the construction company. Which is exactly why this challenge won't hold up in court, Emma assured me, echoing my thoughts. But it will delay things, which I suspect is precisely the point. Time for what? I wondered aloud. To wear me down? To hope my resolve weakens? To find new leverage? All seemed equally plausible given what I knew of James's strategic mind. In the weeks since our confrontation at the house, James had cycled through multiple approaches. First came the remorseful texts and voicemails pleading for another chance. When those went unanswered, he switched to mutual friends as intermediaries, asking them to check on me and subtly, or not so subtly, advocate for his case. When I politely but firmly shut down those conversations, he escalated to more dramatic gestures. Flowers delivered to my parents' house, a handwritten letter detailing all the ways he would change, even showing up at the bank where I worked, with tearful apologies that left my colleagues uncomfortable and me mortified. Each attempt felt more desperate than the last, but also more manipulative, as if he were working through a playbook of tactics to regain control. None of them touched the core of me anymore. The Caroline who might have been swayed by such displays had been left behind at that lake house, replaced by a woman who recognized these gestures for what they were, performances designed to elicit a specific emotional response rather than genuine efforts at amends. "There's something else," Emma said, pulling another document from her folder. James is claiming that certain assets should be considered separate property, despite being acquired during the marriage. Specifically, the vacation home in Aspen and his recent executive bonus. I raised an eyebrow. The same Aspen property, where he took Vanessa on business trips. Emma nodded, a hint of satisfaction in her expression. The very same, which gives us interesting leverage, especially since you have documentation showing it was purchased with commingled funds. "I'm not looking to destroy him," I said quietly. "I just want what's fair." "Fair would have been your husband not sleeping with your employee," she replied bluntly. "We're well past fair now. We're talking about equitable, and that means ensuring you're not disadvantaged by James's attempts to shield assets that rightfully should be divided." She wasn't wrong, but something about the escalating legal battle left me feeling hollow. This wasn't what I had wanted. This protracted, potentially ugly dismantling of a life we'd built together. I had hoped for a clean break, a dignified uncoupling that would allow us both to move forward without unnecessary pain or bitterness. But James, it seemed, had other ideas. "There's one more thing you should know," Emma said, her tone softening slightly. "James has requested a face-to-face mediation session outside of court, just the two of you, with a professional mediator and your respective lawyers. He's claiming that direct communication might facilitate a more amicable resolution." "And what do you think?" I asked, watching her face carefully. Emma considered the question, tapping her pen thoughtfully against her legal pad. "Professionally, I think mediation can sometimes be productive, especially if both parties are genuinely interested in an equitable solution. Personally," she paused, choosing her words with care, "I've seen cases like this before. When one party feels they're losing control, they often seek face-to-face meetings as a way to re-establish emotional leverage." That matched my own instinct. James couldn't reach me through texts or intermediaries or grand gestures. A mediation session would give him direct access, an opportunity to deploy the full range of his persuasive skills in person. "I'll think about it," I said finally, gathering my purse. "In the meantime, how do we respond to this prenup challenge?" Emma outlined our counter-strategy as she walked me to the office door. Her confidence was reassuring. As I stepped into the hallway, she touched my arm lightly. "Caroline, you're doing remarkably well through all this. Many clients in your position would be falling apart, especially given the personal complications of your situation. But don't hesitate to reach out if you need support beyond the legal aspects. Divorce is an emotional marathon, not a sprint." I thanked her and made my way to the elevator, reflecting on her words. The truth was, I did feel remarkably steady given the circumstances. The initial shock and pain had given way to a strange clarity, a purpose that carried me through even the most difficult moments. It wasn't that I didn't feel the hurt. It surfaced at unexpected times, like when I found James's favorite coffee mug among my belongings, or when a song we'd danced to at our wedding played in a store. But the hurt no longer defined me or my decisions. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor, and I stepped out into the bright February sunshine, mentally reviewing my afternoon plans. I had a meeting with my new team at the bank to continue developing the Women's Financial Empowerment Initiative, followed by a viewing of an apartment in a downtown high-rise. After staying with my parents for nearly a month, I was ready for my own space. Somewhere that had never been touched by James, that held no memories or associations with our shared past. A blank canvas on which to paint my new life. I was halfway to my car when my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. "Caroline Ellis speaking," I said, automatically, using my maiden name, which I'd legally reclaimed the previous week. "Caroline, it's Richard Montgomery." James's father's voice was strained, lacking its usual confident authority. A knot formed in my stomach. Despite everything, I'd always respected Richard. Unlike his son, the elder Montgomery built his construction company through honest work and genuine relationships. "Richard," I acknowledged, keeping my tone neutral. "How are you?" "I've been better," he admitted. "I'm at Memorial Hospital. It's James. There's been an accident." My fingers tightened around the phone. "Is he all right?" "Single car accident on Route 16. They say he was driving too fast, lost control on the curve near Milligan's farm. He's in surgery now. Broken ribs, collapsed lung, head trauma. They're not sure." The information hit me in waves, each more disorienting than the last. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the legal battles, the thought of James seriously injured sent a jolt of genuine concern through me. "I'm on my way," I said without hesitation. "Caroline, you don't have to—" "I know," I cut him off gently. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to Memorial Hospital was a blur, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to confront. What if James died? What if the last interaction we ever had was that tense confrontation at our house? The thought was unbearable. Not because I still loved him. That love had died long before I discovered his betrayal, but because it would mean such a final, unresolved ending to what had once been the central relationship of my adult life. I found Richard in the surgical waiting room, looking older and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. Victoria sat beside him, her usually perfect appearance disheveled, eyes red from crying. They both looked up as I approached, surprise and relief mingling on their faces. You came, Victoria said softly, rising to embrace me. It was an unexpected gesture from a woman who had always maintained a certain formality, even with family. Of course, I replied, returning the embrace briefly before turning to Richard. Any updates? He shook his head. Still in surgery. The doctor said it could be hours. I nodded, settling into a chair across from them. We sat in silence for a while, the awkwardness of our new reality. No longer family, but not quite strangers, temporarily, suspended by the gravity of the situation. I owe you an apology, Richard said suddenly, breaking the silence. For what it's worth, I never knew the extent of James's indiscretions until you showed me those documents. I knew he was unhappy, restless, but I thought it was just the usual mid-30s crisis of purpose. I studied him. This man who had built a business from nothing, who had raised a son who somehow lacked his moral compass. You raised him better than that, I said quietly. Richard's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Did I? Sometimes I wonder. Victoria and we gave him everything, perhaps too much. He never had to struggle, to face consequences. The company was handed to him, ready to run. Victoria reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. We can't blame ourselves for his choices. Richard, James is a grown man. He made his decisions. The echo of my mother's words about my own self-blame struck me. How universal this impulse was, to search for the root cause of someone else's betrayal within ourselves. She's right, I said. James chose his path. The company, the affair, all of it. Those were his decisions, not reflections of your parenting. Richard nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. We lapsed back into silence, the only sounds the soft beeping of distant medical equipment and the occasional announcement over the hospital PA system. 3 hours later, a surgeon in scrubs approached us, his expression carefully neutral in that way medical professionals master, revealing nothing until they're ready to speak. Family of James Montgomery? He asked, glancing between us. We all stood. Yes, Richard answered. I'm his father. This is his mother, and I'm his wife, I said, the word feeling strange on my tongue after weeks of calling myself James's soon-to-be ex. The surgeon nodded. Mr. Montgomery is out of surgery. We've repaired the pneumothorax, the collapsed lung, and stabilized his other injuries. The most concerning was the head trauma, but the pressure has stabilized, and initial scans show no permanent damage. Victoria sagged with relief, and Richard put an arm around her shoulders to steady her. He's going to be all right? I asked, needing the explicit confirmation. Barring any complications, yes. He's young and otherwise healthy, which works in his favor. He'll have a long recovery ahead. Physical therapy, possibly some cognitive therapy depending on how the head injury resolves. But I expect a full recovery, eventually. The relief that washed over me was genuine, but complex. I was thankful James would live, would recover. But it changed nothing about our situation, about the decisions I'd made. Can we see him? Victoria asked. He's in recovery now, still under anesthesia. Once he's moved to the ICU, you can visit briefly, one at a time. I should warn you, he'll be heavily sedated and on a ventilator for at least the next 24 hours. After the surgeon left, I turned to Richard and Victoria. I should go. You two should be with him when he wakes up. Victoria looked startled. But surely you want to see him too? I shook my head. I came to make sure he was going to be all right, and he is. But I'm not the person he needs right now. Richard studied me for a moment, then nodded in understanding. Will you at least let us call you with updates? Of course, I agreed. And if there's anything you need, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. As I walked back to my car in the hospital parking lot, I felt lighter somehow. Not because James's accident absolved him of his betrayal or changed my decision to divorce him, but because it had shown me that I could feel compassion for him without being drawn back into his orbit. I could wish him well while still choosing myself. 3 months after James's accident, I stood in the center of my new apartment, surrounded by moving boxes and the scent of fresh paint. The downtown high-rise offered sweeping views of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows, modern amenities, and most importantly, no memories. Every piece of furniture, every decorative item, every dish and towel had been selected by me alone, creating a space that reflected only my taste and preferences. James had recovered remarkably well, according to Richard's occasional updates. He'd been released from the hospital after 2 weeks, undergone intensive physical therapy, and was now back at work. Not at Montgomery Construction, which remained under new ownership, but at a smaller firm in the neighboring city. The accident had apparently inspired some soul-searching. He'd withdrawn his challenge to our prenuptial agreement, allowing the divorce to proceed without further legal battles. We had finalized the divorce just last week, a surreal experience of signing papers across a conference table, formally ending 8 years of marriage with a few strokes of a pen. James had been subdued, his usual charismatic presence dimmed by the events of the past months. We spoke only of necessary logistics, and when it was over, he'd simply said, "I hope you find what you're looking for, Caroline." "I already have," I'd replied, not with malice but with the simple truth. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my reflections. I navigated through the maze of boxes to answer it, finding my brother William on the other side, arms laden with takeout bags. "Housewarming delivery," he announced, stepping inside and whistling at the view. "Damn, Caroline, this place is spectacular." "It's home," I said simply, clearing a space at the kitchen counter for the food. William began unpacking containers of Chinese food while I searched for plates among the boxes. "So," he said casually, "I ran into James yesterday." My hands stilled momentarily. "Oh? Yeah, at that coffee place near my office." William studied me. "You don't seem bothered by running into him eventually." I'm not, I realized, somewhat surprised by my own equanimity. The city's not that big. We're bound to cross paths. "And you're okay with that?" I considered the question as I set out the plates and found utensils. I'm at peace with it. James was a chapter in my life, an important one, for better and worse. But that chapter's closed now. William nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer. "Well, in that case, let's toast to new beginnings." He raised his water glass. "To Caroline 2.0, wiser, stronger, and with a killer apartment." I laughed, clinking my glass against his. "I'll drink to that." After dinner, William helped me unpack some of the heavier items, mounting my television and assembling a bookshelf. As we worked, we talked about everything and nothing. His children's latest exploits, my progress with the women's financial initiative at the bank, a movie we both wanted to see. It was nearly 9 when he left, promising to return the next day with his wife to help with the remaining boxes. I closed the door behind him and surveyed my half-unpacked apartment. Despite the chaos, it already felt more like home than the house I'd shared with James ever had. My phone pinged with an email notification. Opening it, I found a message from the community college where I'd applied for an adjunct position teaching financial literacy. the same position I'd turned down years ago at James's urging. They were offering me the Thursday evening slot for the fall semester. A slow smile spread across my face as I typed my acceptance. Another piece of myself reclaimed, another dream resurrected. Later, as I stood on my balcony watching the city, lights twinkle like earthbound stars, I reflected on the journey of the past 4 months. The pain had been real, the betrayal devastating. But from those ashes had risen a version of myself I'd almost forgotten existed. A woman who knew her worth, who made choices based on her own desires rather than someone else's expectations, who was building a life that felt authentic and full. The scars remained, of course. Trust would come harder in future relationships. I was more vigilant now about maintaining my boundaries, more attuned to the subtle ways in which someone might try to diminish me. But these weren't weaknesses. They were wisdom earned through difficult experience. My phone rang, disrupting my contemplation. It was my mother. "Just checking in," she said when I answered. "How's the unpacking going?" "Slowly but surely," I replied, smiling at her transparent excuse to make sure I was okay. "And you? How are you feeling about everything?" I gazed out at the city skyline, considering her question. "I'm good, Mom. Really good, actually. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "That's all I've ever wanted for you," she said softly. "To find your place in the world, not as someone's wife or daughter, but as Caroline." "I know," I said, grateful for her unwavering support throughout this tumultuous time. "And I have. It just took a detour to get here." After we hung up, I remained on the balcony, breathing in the cool night air. The woman who had stood frozen in humiliation at that Christmas dinner, watching her marriage publicly unravel, had become someone new, or perhaps more accurately, she had become herself again, the self that had been waiting all along beneath the layers of compromise and accommodation, ready to emerge when the moment finally arrived. That moment had come disguised as catastrophe, but looking back now with the perspective of 4 months' growth and healing, I recognized it for what it truly was: liberation. The path forward wasn't perfectly clear. Life rarely offers that kind of certainty. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, perhaps even missteps. But for the first time in years, I was navigating that path guided by my own internal compass rather than someone else's map. And that made all the difference. Tomorrow would bring more unpacking, more decisions, more steps toward building this new life. But tonight, standing under the vast canopy of stars that had witnessed my unraveling and my rebirth, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey. Not despite its difficulty, but because of it. After all, it was the breaking that had allowed the light to enter, illuminating parts of myself I had forgotten existed. It was the shattering that had created space for something stronger, more authentic to emerge. I had lost a husband, yes, but I had found myself. And that, I now understood with bone-deep certainty, was the more precious discovery by far. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.